And he doesn't escape, basically, from this. He is out in Siberia for years, nearly 4 years. And he suffers terribly for quite a while. I mean, after about a year or two into this sentence, he's sort of sorted himself out and he's had a bit of money, and he even sends a letter back to someone that sends him a care package saying, oh, you know, keep your money, you don't have to send me this anymore, but thanks a lot. Send me postcards, but, you know, keep your money. But to begin with, when he gets there, their letters, they're really like, I'm going to die soon if I can't afford a bit of medicine, things like that. So again, it probably would have been better for the world if he had just succumbed to a chest infection or something at that point, but he didn't. He treats all other exiles out there really badly. Part of the thing you can imagine in the communities like that, little things like who owns the books, like who controls some of the books. And Stalin just takes the piss out of everyone he can. But when they try and sort of say anything to him, he just treats them like they're a private and he's a general. So he's already got that sort of super arrogance. Well, he's always had that, actually. People have always said about him that he was quite an arrogant personality. Yeah, and he's actually thinking about trying to escape, but it's not really all that possible. But the fact that he's actually even thinking about it, the cops that are assigned, not only is he sent to this deepest Siberia, but he's issued with an individual cop whose sole job is to make sure he doesn't escape, to actually keep an eye on him, a relatively close eye on him. And this cop gets wind that Stalin's thinking of even trying to escape. So what they do is they send him even further north, like not a vast amount further, but even further north to an even more remote, tiny little place called, I'm probably pronouncing this wrong, but called Kugara, I think it's pronounced. And that is really the ends of the earth almost. There's like 8 families that live in this tiny little hamlet, and they're all sort of ultra impoverished, eking out whatever they can from the ground. Just going hungry a lot. They say like one day we would have like a broth made of the last turnip or whatever, and the following day the only thing we'd have to eat is God's grace. In other words, nothing. And Stalin's sent up there with an individual set of eyes on him. So they've obviously realised this. They're not going to muck about with him anymore. This idea of capture, escape, that game is over. And I suppose at some point Stalin accepts it, I suppose, because what happens over the next 3 years or whatever he's up there is that he accepts the Siberian nomadic hunter-gatherer, like wild outdoorsman thing into his heart. He embraces it. He ends up like learning loads of techniques for fishing and hunting and stuff off the local tribesmen, like these indigenous Tunguska, like reindeer herdsmen type dudes, and he learns loads off them, like all survival techniques and things. And you have to be, again, a hard character to deal with that, like the solitudes and the darkness and the struggle for everything, every tiny thing. I don't know if you ever watched Survival, like Ray Mears or whatever, when they do, or Bear Grylls when they do Arctic stuff. Oh, it's hellacious, really. And to live it for months or years on end. So Stalin was already a man of steel, if you like, a streetwise fighter turned gangster turned terrorist, and then you throw him into a years-long survival ordeal that he in the end passes with flying colours. Yeah, out of the other end of that is going to come a hardened individual on many levels. For example, there's one anecdote where he gets almost lost in the wilderness. He goes out on just a solo hunting expedition or whatever, and he almost gets lost, and he comes back and he's just completely covered in frost. They would wear like reindeer furs. That's like the best thing you could possibly wear. But if it gets cold enough, even they will frost up. And, you see guys, pictures of guys trying to do Antarctic crossings, and all their beard and moustache just covered in white frost. And apparently he comes traipsing out of the forest, out of the tundra, looking like some sort of white yeti or something, and the tribesmen, the Tunguska tribesmen, think he is some sort of evil forest spirit, and they will run away from him. And eventually he gets back to like the shack or whatever, and comes in. They're like, "Oh, it's you. We thought you was a forest spirit," and he's all pissed off with them. But no, apparently he spent loads of times, like, he would just go off for like weeks on end into the frozen tundras and onto frozen lakes and fish and catch massive sturgeons and stuff on his own. So yeah, he actually became good at surviving up there. Something else went down when he was up there, which is worth mentioning, because the pattern has always been that he would end up sleeping with like the people that put him up, either the landlady, or if the landlady's daughter is prettier, usually her. This time, when they send him into that town that hamlet even further north, where there's only like 8 families there, he shacks up with one of the families, and he starts a sexual liaison with the daughter of that family, but she's 13. Her name's Lydia, and yeah, it just sort of openly is having an affair with her, and her family don't like it. I mean, they're all sharing one sort of open room, apparently. One sort of dungy, fuggy, open room. And of course they would have some privacy for when they needed privacy, but it's out in the open, basically, that he's sleeping with this 13-year-old. And there were laws against it, but it was, fairly common that a 14 or 15 or 16-year-old girl get pregnant. Oh, it's still fairly common now in teenage pregnancies, not millions of teenage pregnancies, but it's still totally not okay that he's sleeping with this 13-year-old Lydia. Oh, and he gets her pregnant, but he would just go off on, a fishing trip for months on end. The policeman that was sent to keep his eyes on Stalin the whole time, after a while Stalin sends a petition to like the authorities back home saying, "I want a different cop because this guy's invading my privacy too much." There's one anecdote when the cop bursts in on him, apparently with his 13-year-old, and Stalin goes mental and like chases him all around, and after that says, "I insist on someone else coming to guard me." And amazingly, the authorities okay it, and they send him a different guy. And this different guy, the new one, is just totally more lax. It's like not keeping a close eye on Stalin at all. For example, one time Stalin disappears off into the forests for actually months on end, and the guy said, "Oh, I was just following the rumour that he hadn't actually escaped. He's just on a really long hunting trip." And he was. And years and years later, like when Stalin was in the Kremlin, he still said, I'll always thank that guy for being cool, basically, for not being such a douchebag about everything. And that guy, that cop replacement that was sort of a bit more lax, at one point during the terror was accused of being a kulak, in other words, a peasant that owned property, who, you get sent to a gulag for that. And they think that he was almost certainly spared personally by Stalin because of that. Like, so there's one, I've seen these death lists they would have, thousands of names sometimes, and as I mentioned before, Stalin might put a note, "I want more," but every now and again, really, really rarely, but every now and again he'd cross a name out and save that person. So anyway, he gets this Lydia pregnant, she has the baby dies in infancy almost straight away. I mean, perhaps not surprising up there, but only the strongest babies live. So Stalin's sort of off the hook in that sense for that. So he gets her pregnant again. She just gets pregnant again. And remember, so this is World War I started at this time. Stalin spends all of World War I, basically, as far as Russia's concerned, safely, in inverted commas, up in Siberia. Far away from the fighting. He's spared all that fighting. He is out of the loop, though. I mean, really out of the loop. He asks some of the leading lights like Lenin and Zinoviev or Kamenev, these top boys, he asks them to help him out and to keep telling him the news and stuff, but they sort of don't very much. They do send him a bit of money and they do correspond with him a bit, but they've got bigger fish to fry. He's basically out of the picture. They can't help him much. But he doesn't ever forget that as well. He sort of holds it against a lot of them, that they could have done more for him and didn't. But yeah, he's totally out of the loop. World War One's going on, which he obviously has got no power over, can't do anything with that, and is embroiled in like an Arctic sex scandal, basically. So Stalin spent so long up in Siberia in the end that it really seemed to have affected him. He sort of took it entirely on board as part of his character, and, you know, made him even more icy, if you like. One of the things that actually happened up there towards the end of his term in deepest Siberia is that a couple of people came up to visit him. He was, as I said, he had a replacement cop that was to watch him, and he was a bit more lax, and Stalin was actually able to, he wasn't entirely confined to just the ultra northern hamlet. He was actually able to travel a little bit around. And anyway, at one point he's visited in 1915. He's visited by Kamenev, who's been sent to exile as well, who's one of the leading lights. And there's a story from this time that often gets mentioned in histories or biographies of Stalin, and I guess I'll have to mention it. I've heard it attributed to a completely different time in Stalin's life as well, in the 30s, but I think it's from this point in 1915. They are having a dinner one night, and there's lots of exiles, Bolsheviks sitting around, and Kamenev asks the group what they think is their greatest pleasure in life, and people give different answers, and really some people apparently give your classic Marxist answer saying my greatest pleasure in life is the progress of dialectical materialism towards the workers' paradise, something that you'd think that they would want to hear, real commie stuff. But apparently Stalin thinks about it for a minute and says, my greatest pleasure is to choose one's victim, prepare one's plans minutely, slake an implacable vengeance, then go to bed. There's nothing sweeter in the world. If that quote is true, which I think it is, I don't think there's any doubt you said it. It's just a bit mental, isn't it? Completely in the realm of a psycho. Who says that, really? I mean, it's also a bit perfect because he went on to, act like that. But yeah, anyway. So while he's up there, as I mentioned before, he got that Lydia pregnant, and the baby died, but then he got her pregnant again, and that baby did live. But he again, when it came his time to leave, he did just leave, and he never went back and had any sort of he didn't have any connection with the child. And Simon Montefiore writes, quote, Stalin never contacted her, meaning Lydia. He was utterly unfettered by paternal feelings or even sentimental curiosity. Stalin abandoned his son, but Turkhansk somehow made him more of a Russian. Perhaps Siberia froze some of the Georgian exoticism out of him. He brought the self-reliance, vigilance, fragility and solitude of the Siberian hunter with him to the Kremlin. End quote. That puts it more perfectly than I could say. And as I mentioned before, Molotov was one of the few that actually went through the whole process with him from those early days, those early pre-World War I days, all the way through to Stalin's death in the early 50s. And Molotov was on record as saying, quote, a little piece of Siberia remained lodged in Stalin for the rest of his life, quote. And I think that's true. I definitely think that seems to ring true when you know everything that he went on to do. So, yeah, Stalin spent all but, I think, about 4 months of his 4-year term in Siberia. The thing that eventually happened was the Russian Revolution in 1917. So, there was 2 revolutions in 1917. So what happened was, there was the February Revolution, which saw the Tsar toppled, and the Tsar had to abdicate I think he abdicated in March. So that's the February Revolution. And so the Tsar is now, no longer the ruler. But it wasn't until October 1917, a second revolution, where the Bolsheviks seized control of the Winter Palace and installed themselves as the kernel of a Soviet government. So there was a whole chunk in the middle of 1917 where there was a provisional government, just murky, messy bit of Russian history there. So there's actually two revolutions. But after the February Revolution, that's when Stalin could essentially just leave. The state had fallen apart. I read somewhere that it said that the provisional government that came in basically allowed exiles to return. Any exiles that there were not forced to stay there anymore. The authority that was keeping them there no longer existed. It became a bit of a free-for-all, if you like. But the upshot of it is, Stalin just left. He only had a few months left to serve, but he just left Siberia and came back. I mean, you get news that the thing you've been fighting for your whole adult life, the grand goal of toppling the Tsar, this happened. There is going to be a provisional government. So, of course, you want to be in on that. Yeah, so in the February Revolution, the Bolsheviks weren't a huge part of it. Their time comes later in the year. The thing they celebrate through the rest of their history is the October Revolution. That's when they went from just another faction of people vying to be in the mix to being the government. So the thing that they would make propaganda videos, propaganda movies about and stuff. But no, as soon as the February Revolution happened, it was on. You know, Lenin at the time was in Germany, and the Germans even... I won't go into it because there's so much written about it, but there's a special armoured train that they sent him straight to Russia because the Germans thought, yeah, if we can now sow discord and discontent and disharmony within Russia, they're going to just drop out of the war, which is what happened. You know, the Tsarist regime falls and the provisional government that comes in drops out of World War One. Capitulates to the Germans, basically, you know, signs a treaty that just is really, really advantageous for the Germans, and the Germans can now, at that point, ship all their men over that were fighting on their eastern front to the western front. So it was a great ploy by the Germans, in the short term at least, to whisk Lenin straight to where he wanted to go, straight to the centre of action in St. Petersburg. Well, the way it happened was that Russia were doing really badly in World War One. That's basically what happened. They lost a couple of really big battles, and the Tsar Nicholas II had installed himself as the head of the commander-in-chief. I mean, he's nominally the commander-in-chief, I suppose, anyway, because he's the autocrat of all Russia, but he put himself as the actual commander-in-chief in the field. So when they did really badly in the actual war, it just ebbed away any support he actually had, even from like his own generals. And then it just got worse and worse and worse. I mean, this has been years. He was nearly toppled in 1904. So his position has been shaky for years and years and years. And that was just the final straw, really, where even all the people around him had lost any faith in him personally. Because that's what an autocracy is. To be a Tsar, to be a king, it's about your personality, your personal ability to rule, to do it. I mean, even his wife, they just lost any faith that he was capable of doing it. And he was weak. I mean, like I say, he wasn't really cut out for it. So in the end, his own generals and the people closest to him in the royal family were like, you know, you've got no option but to abdicate, really. So he did abdicate, and he put one of his members of his own family, like Prince Michael, I think it was made military dictator for a couple of days, but then that fell apart. It just got really messy really quickly. And the first provisional government that came in, that took over from him, they weren't the people that had him killed, because you probably know that the Tsar and all his family ended up getting shot. So yeah, it's a little bit of a sad story of what happened to them. They just got pushed around from pillar to post. At first they weren't just completely imprisoned in cells or anything. At some point they were taken off. They were sort of kept in sort of what you would call house arrest, I suppose, for a while. And then eventually they were, at least in theory, shipped off to somewhere in Siberia for their own safety. They're now just the way we treat our royal family. They're sort of puppets for the state in a way, trotted out when they needed to be, you know, for state occasions. You know, the government writes the Queen's speech. So our monarchy is little more than a rubber stamp these days. So the Tsar and the royal family went from being true rulers to just little more than a rubber stamp. And anyway, their authority and power just ebbed away slowly over months, and they weren't killed until 1918. But yeah, they were shipped off, him and his wife and their kids. They had loads of daughters, and the son, the Tsarevich, who was poorly, or he had haemophilia, so he was really fragile. Yeah, he was a fragile kid. And they were all sent off to Siberia, where they were kept in fairly bad conditions, but not terrible. It's not like a gulag or anything, but they weren't living in a palace. But they were kept under armed guard the whole time. And it gets worse and worse and worse until at some point they're shipped back somewhere else, a bit further west. And their train that they're on gets intercepted by another train that's full of Bolsheviks, hardline Bolsheviks. This is after the Bolsheviks have come to power. And the Bolsheviks there's a bit of a standoff between these two trains, like what's going to happen between these guards that are guarding the royal family from the provisional government and this new lot of Bolsheviks that have turned up. A bit of a standoff happens, who's going to take control of them. But the Bolsheviks end up winning, and they take control of them, and they ship them off somewhere else to another sort of safe house, where it's a bit more grim, and they're given food that isn't as nice, and eventually the word comes to them from up on high that they're to be done away with. So their Bolshevik captors just lead them into a cellar and then shoot them. And there's the old conspiracy theory that some of the daughters might have lived, like one of the daughters, Anastasia Romanov, might have lived, but it's almost certainly not true. And then that was the end of the 300-year-long Romanov dynasty, and Russia hasn't had a monarchy since. But yeah, so Stalin just leaves Siberia and goes back to St. Petersburg, where he immediately just goes to the Pravda offices, installs himself as the editor again. You know, just turns up like, I'm the editor now. So St. Petersburg at this period, apparently, according to the accounts, is just going a bit crazy. Just soldiers have just been killed and lynched in the streets, and police officers just killed in the streets and stuff, and local armories and raided, people just driving around shooting in the air, and there's even accounts of people just like having sex in the street and stuff. I'm not sure how true that is, it might have been exaggerated after the fact, but it paints a picture of just almost anarchy happening in the streets. It doesn't last all that long, but yeah, those few days or weeks apparently were a bit crazy. Yeah. And you know, in those sort of situations, old scores get settled. You know, whenever a oppressive regime topples, whatever it is, you know, like Vichy France or Colonel Gaddafi or whatever it is, the people that had collaborated with it, they quite often come to sticky ends. People take their vengeance out on the handful of people that they know. So anyway, all that's going on. So what happens is there's a provisional government, and it's a really weak provisional government led by a guy called Kerensky. And so, as I said before, the Tsar had set up this Duma, which is a type of parliament. So this Duma, but it had a small amount of power still under the Tsar. Really just like an advisory body, or a bit more than that, but nothing like the type of parliament we've got that's got full executive power to make and break all laws. But when the Tsar fell, it did have that. It now became the actual centre of power. But it was weak, like lots of parliamentary systems. Well, it's far weaker than an autocracy, and it couldn't really get much done. It was always tottering, and it always I've heard it described loads of times as not making its mind up on the key issues, like whether it should allow a completely free press and whether it should allow a completely free opposition or not, whether it should, you know, kind of clamp down in the short term to make things work, or whether it should attempt to be openly liberal in the sense of, say, Britain or America at that time. and it sort of vacillated between those things. And anyway, it was just really weak, and it left, eventually over months, left the door open for hardline revolutionaries that have got a very, very clear idea of what they want the state and the government to be. Like Marxists, I mean, you might think that they're misguided or that their ideology is just flawed, but at least the Marxists do have a clear plan of exactly what they wanted to do. And yeah, it might have been oppressive, but it was something. Yeah, so when the provisional government eventually fell, there was just going to be a vacuum for, you know, whoever was strong enough, or whoever was present to take up the reins. It seems that in the October Revolution, when this provisional government did fall for the last time, and the Bolsheviks took control of the Winter Palace, it seems that there was just no fight at all left in the powers that be. So there were there were Cossacks that were guarding the Winter Palace, and people had been protesting for a couple of days beforehand, and apparently there were a lot of women. I mentioned before that the communists are always happy to have women in the forefront of their movement, and apparently the really brave women, like labourers, actual workers, sort of really pushed the issue. There was like an International Women's Workers' Day or something like this, and the Cossacks weren't prepared to just whip or shoot these women. You know, there was a big protest, and if you're going to put down a protest with violence, you've got to, you know, shoot indiscriminately into a crowd, or just ride your horses into a crowd of people. And if you're sort of sympathetic to them, and they're women, and they're like pouring scorn on you for protecting a clearly finished regime that is entirely hollow, it just got to the point where the Cossacks weren't prepared to kill protesters anymore, basically. And so they were able to rush in and seize control of the state. You know, it wasn't as simple as that. They were organised. They were able to take key strategic points, like the mail offices in Petrograd, St. Petersburg. You could seize control of the telegraph exchanges. That's like an early 20th century example of, you know, trying to control the airwave. So yeah, the Bolsheviks were able to seize control of key points, and but even after the October Revolution in 1917, it was far from certain that this new government under Lenin would be successful or would be able to keep power. Because it's one thing just to seize it from a state that isn't entirely imploded, or it's imploded a couple of times over already. That's one thing, to just get a mob of workers to seize control of a palace and stuff, but to then fight a protracted and brutal civil war, and at the end of it have Lenin and his cronies, such as Stalin, and Trotsky and Zinoviev and Kamenev, for them guys to end up in in an all-powerful iron grip on the whole of the Russian Empire, and turn it into a Soviet Union, a union of the workers' Soviets. I mean, that was an incredible achievement, I suppose. Obviously, in my opinion, not a great achievement, but an incredible feat. But yeah, even in October 1917, it was far from certain. But it's one of those things in history, like I say, like the D-Day landings not being repulsed, for example. It seems, if you just look at history, that was always going to be. It's hard to imagine that not being the case. It's a bit like that with the Russian Revolution. It's hard to think that it was never going to be, or rather that the Red Bolsheviks were always destined to be the rulers. But you know, the reality was that it was a close run thing. And anyway, yeah, just to close it off, I suppose, Lenin is the sort of undisputed leader of the whole thing, but he gets ill quite quickly. He dies in, I think, 1924, but even by 1921 he's like getting quite badly ill, and the last sort of year or more of his life he is not really in control. In the last few months of his life he can't even speak. He gets something wrong with his brain. There's something really quite badly wrong with his brain. It's like a degenerative thing, and I was about to say it's sad. Like, the last pictures you see of him, he's really, really wizened and frail, and obviously bit insane. But it's not really that sad because Lenin is a psycho piece of shit. So it's not actually sad, but still, that's what happens to Lenin. So it's a bit of a dark end for Lenin. But when Lenin does eventually die, Stalin, just as you can imagine, ruthlessly installs himself as the next in line. Because it's not immediately clear, he doesn't get like a coronation like Gordon Brown. That it is really between him and Trotsky who's going to take over, and a lot of people would have preferred Trotsky, and apparently Lenin, one of the last things he wrote was that it shouldn't be Stalin. But Stalin it's already too late really, because Stalin, by the time Lenin dies, Stalin has already got control of the Politburo, which is an even smaller bit of the central committee at the top of the party. Stalin's already got complete personal control of the party's communication systems. When information comes in from all over Russia, it comes to a central party hub. One of the things that you would do in any dictatorship is have a strict control of information. Anyway, Stalin controls that entirely, so he's already played the game so that when Lenin dies, he just has to do a couple more ruthless moves, which he does. Trotsky gets exiled, gets put on a show trial, and then exiled. Because it's the early days. If it was, years later, he wouldn't have got away. But as I say, he eventually gets assassinated anyway. And that's it. And then from there, that's the reign, the bloody, terrible reign of Stalin from then on.